Hi there, and welcome to the podcast Life as a show intently focused on exploring and unearthing the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Think back 20 years. Heck, go back further if you can. Try 50 or 100. Now, what is one thing that has been part of our collective human experience during those time frames? Well, I'm thinking media. For example, the radio broadcasting of music and talk intended to reach audiences started experimentally between 1905 and 1906. And sure, media has changed, especially in recent times. However, at its core, broadcasting has always been about communicating ideas, news, and events, often based around things like politics, entertainment, arts and science, and so on. And I've got to say, we're all in for a treat today. Joining today's program is a guest who has built a phenomenal career in public broadcast and journalism. He is someone that will help undoubtedly pull back the curtain on this profession. Adam Walsh is the host and producer of CrossTalk, a lunchtime provincial radio program in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The show is a virtual town square where people meet to be informed, engaged, and entertained. A show that meets people in both their digital and actual neighborhoods, a program that reflects contemporary Newfoundland and Labrador by serving basic purpose of modern public broadcasting, building community by bringing people together and helping them understand one another and the world around them. Adam's been with the CBC, Canada's public broadcaster, for over 10 years. In 2014, Adam was part of a team that won the Atlantic Canada Journalism Gold Award Television Enterprise Reporting for an investigation into the local renovation industry. Then, in 2015, he went to China after being awarded the Asia Pacific's Foundation Media Fellowship to report on Canada's attempt to move further into the Chinese seafood market. Later, in 2015, he moved to Japan through a CBC agreement with Japanese public broadcaster NHK. Adam stayed in Japan, working for NHK's international news program Newsline as an advising producer. He also traveled all over Japan and elsewhere, covering the anniversaries of the atomic bombings in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the anniversary of the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster. Adam was also in Washington, D.C. to cover Donald Trump's inauguration. In June of 2021, Adam started filling in as the host of CrossTalk and became its permanent host in October of that year. I mean, what else is to be said? A true broadcast professional through and through. Adam, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to get into all of this with you today. And thanks so much for giving some time.
Well, day's just finishing here on the east coast of Canada, the right-hand edge of North America, and I figured what a great way to end my day than to have a chat.
Yeah, perfect. I'm glad you see it that way. Well, why don't we get right into it? I've got my first segment lined up here. It's something called Coloring Wikipedia. And basically what I do here is I read off a definition of your career as defined by Wikipedia. And I like to do this for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, it brings everyone up to speed. And then two, for the guest, I feel it offers a nice jumping off point. It highlights some of the points within their profession, but also there's probably things that aren't included. And it's always fun to explore all of that. So I do have you down, of course, surprise, surprise, for broadcaster. So let me just read that out for you now. All right, here goes. Broadcaster. Broadcaster may refer to a presenter of any syndicated media program. A presenter is a person or organization responsible for the running of a public event or someone who conveys information on media via a broadcasting outlet. Presenter may refer to the following roles: news presenter, sports commentator, radio personality, television presenter, talk show host. Alrighty, there it is, Adam. I mean, it is a little bit vague. It is a little bit general, as is often the case. And I feel in a way, Wikipedia is letting us down a little bit here, but perhaps you could bring us up to speed on your professional duties as they relate to, hosting and producing CrossTalk.
Yeah, sure. So when you're a host and producer, like I have a daily show, right? So it's Monday to Friday, it's on lunchtime, and I have to look, like you said off the top, right? If you're having this kind of a community, this town square, a virtual town square for a conversation, I need to figure out well, what types of topics am I going to have, right? So you're kind of looking at what's in the news, you're looking at what's being kind of discussed around, whether water coolers or dinner tables, that type of a thing, or you're looking for stories in the community that people don't even know that they want to hear about. And so once I look at all those and have rough plans for where things are going, then I have to phone people, do pre-interviews, line up guests, write out shows. If I'm out collecting tape, and then I sometimes have to produce that tape and turn it into something and mix it with music. It all depends on the show, the day, but it's like the 1 hour of talking on the radio is just a small part of the show, and everything else, there's so much more behind it in order to get that 1 hour every day, which also can be a lot sometimes.
Yeah, no, I hear you completely. Even producing a program like this, it's a microcosm sort of representation of what you're just speaking about. And yeah, there is a lot to it on that research side. And the finished product, like you said, is a very tiny, tiny little piece of the entire picture. In terms of some of those roles that you just listed off, are there any that, I don't know, that bring you particular joys or, frustrations at times?
So I'll start with the frustrations first, and then I'll go to joy.
Let's get them out of the way.
You always want more time, like there's what you're capable of if everything works out the right way and if you've got the resources you need for doing something. But then there's the reality of like, well, hey, noon is coming up. Right. Yeah. Noon is always approaching until noon hits, and then the next noon is coming. So that can be like the frustrating bit. And also lately, the last couple of years that we've been in with the pandemic, even though the quality has still been really good, a lot of things that we had planned were shelved or canceled. Wow. Right. And I mean, this is everyone. This is every industry. So, but it's. Yeah. It's still kind of hard when you think of like, oh gosh, that would have been so good. And now, as we're hopefully trying to move back into a world where we can do a little bit more now, like for me, outside shows in the community with people around. Oh, nice. And now I'm moving to joy. So the joys of the job, it's talking to people, right? And even I know sometimes like you do in the industry, we call it a pre-interview, right? So if I'm going to have someone on the show tomorrow, I will call them to kind of have a little chat just to see where this interview can go if they're like one of the big guests on the show type of a thing. I enjoy that because a lot of times you have this great conversation with somebody, you create a rapport, and then the next day on the air, you make it so that you've got a good idea of the conversation you're going to have, but then you also kind of leave a couple little bits for some surprises too, right? Like you get the general gist of, because they know they're comfortable with the conversation, the parameters of what you've set up, right? But then I don't know, there's a bit of magic that can happen on the air too when you just leave a couple of things for surprises, and I love that. So that the joy for me, it's people and stories and finding things or like being part of a conversations or being part of something where we're putting stuff out onto the air that, well, like you're doing here now, right? You're putting out stuff on the air that people don't know about and hopefully will enjoy. That's so great.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I can speak to that point and relate to all of what you said. There's something you've said for just that part of almost joyful learning where you're digging in and you're exploring new content, new ways of living, new stories, and like you said, kind of packaging it all up and putting it out there for others to digest and explore for themselves. And there's a magic or there's almost a power to all of that as well. It can be an incredibly rewarding experience. So yeah, I can certainly relate to all of what you just said there. Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. Well, why don't we skip on over into a new segment here, Q&A discovery, where we can continue this sort of back and forth. And I have this first question here for you, Adam. In the beginning, the intro, I referenced something about public broadcast and bringing people together. I think that's a really fascinating sort of take on the role of broadcasting in general. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. If you could explain that sort of further.
I think it's always the public broadcaster's role. Like, your point, you're serving your community, you're serving your province, country, state, whatever you want to call it. I mean, that's at its core for just the responsibilities of it. But nowadays, especially, I think that we're in such a time, there's lots of different types of tensions going on. There's everything from active disinformation to perhaps accidental misinformation, There are people who are, especially during the pandemic, dug into certain positions globally. In this time we're in now, I think it is so important to try to create something that at its core, like the lens that it uses is empathy. And that through everything that goes through there is helping to not create empathy, because I don't like that puts maybe I think a little bit too much responsibilities on the shoulders of the show. But to when you're bringing people in to these conversations, the point is to help create a space where we can all build on empathy, and you learn a little bit about someone else's point of view. You get exposed to a different community that you didn't know about, in terms of not just the festivities and stuff, but I mean just the day to day of whether it's a small business, whether it's how a local how the diaspora of a certain country or area are doing in your part of the country you're in, all that kind of a thing. And if you build it, not to say there's never negative stuff, because we talk about negative stuff on my show, but I do like trying to have learning and empathy along with everything we do, and it's about those types of connections. And I think if you do enough of that, you can help in your own small way make things a little bit better.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I completely agree. I mean, the more you can understand someone else's position, where they're coming from, the context, essentially, I think that allows for that, those feelings of empathy to build and to grow. Oftentimes right now, I feel like the culture that we're within, it's a lot of just this. It's one way. This is what I feel. Here it is. I'm going to unload it all on you. And then the natural reaction of that person is to not really take much of it in, is to like just fire back at, whatever feelings or sentiments that they have. And what's lost in that transaction essentially is that time to digest it and to think about it before, firing off that retort. And a program like what you've got with CrossTalk, I think, as you said, I mean, it allows for that. You can hear these discussions, you can get to know these people and some of the reasons for their thoughts and feelings, and take some time, let it churn within you,
Yeah.
and then come to your own conclusions after you've given some thought to it, rather than just, again, firing something off, whether it's verbally or tweeting something out instantaneously. So yeah, I can definitely see the value in programs much like yours. So
and I'll just add to that too. Like this show, it used to be purely a call-in show, so you'd have like a guest today, and the topic, one question, people would call in. I've changed it a bit in terms of the style. So some days it is still very much a call-in show. So, for example, a very popular thing in the spring and summers, there's a gardening once a week. There's a gardening show. It's very popular, and that I'm keeping because it's a public service. But also, there are days where, like a couple of months back, we did a show on foster families.
okay.
And what it was we had a number of different foster parents on through different parts of the province, talking about different their situations, giving us some context of what it is, like what it takes to become a foster parent. There was a single foster parent on, and she said, it's not just two people, sometimes it's one person like myself. And this was the whole show of these different voices. And I didn't open the phone lines that day because it was a day of like, well, we're listening to this. I've got a whole group of people here talking about these things that, I didn't know about. So I found it really interesting. And then at the end, though, right, well, through the show, I deliver the message is like, if you have thoughts on this, give us a call, leave a message. Here's a line for that. Send us an email, tweet at us. We'll put it together for like the next show or like sometime else this week. And you're contributing that way. But it's still, when you look at the big scope of everything, that is how you it's the different types of conversations you can have in 1 hour to get out the best and all to help build that, or to be part of that empathy building process. Yeah. And then the next day, I think it was something about like, well, what's your, I think we were talking about like streaming or something like that. What's your winter streaming on television? And that was wide open. Anyone could call,
Mm-hmm. In essence, there you go. It comes back around to helping build that community out through sort of activities like that. Yeah. No, that's really fascinating. It's a really interesting way to kind of break it down. It's been really interesting to hear that for myself, and I'm sure listeners will have enjoyed that answer. So thanks so much, Adam.
That's right.
Yeah. All right. Well, I do have another question here, and I'm curious what it's like covering issues that are charged at times. And again, I referenced in your intro, you spent some time abroad within Japan, covering some major events like, the anniversaries of the bombings, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then also the nuclear, and disaster related ceremonies within Fukushima. Certainly those moments, those events are charged with so much emotion. What is it like to cover them? I mean, there's a certain human element to all of that, and also you have the professionalism mixed in. So yeah, maybe you could break that down for us as well.
Well, I mean, I think it's important. The human element is the most important part in it, And then when you're telling stories, it's like they're not my stories, right? So I'm fortunate enough, or to use even the word blessed, to have people share their thoughts and feelings and stories with me. And it's a great responsibility to help present that in the best way possible, And I do think, of course, you have to feel for these types of stories, And yes, of course, I mean, there's a line of professionalism, but then everyone has to know at the same time that this does affect you, right? Like when I in Nagasaki, interviewing a survivor of the bombing, Hibakusha, he told me, we sat down and we had this big conversation with an interpreter, and he showed me the scars he still had on his arms and legs. And talked about his memories. And it was something I walked into. I didn't even know. I hadn't given much thought into how that conversation would go in a way, because I was so new to Japan at the time. And I was with a colleague, but this was what this gentleman's job was that day, right? Like, because he is part of the thing, as right, for the survivors to keep telling the story, because trying to have a world without nuclear weapons, right? But at the same time, as a human being, as a person, it's kind of like, I also don't want to re-victimize someone, and like those thoughts are there too. So these are all delicate. Yeah. It is, right? And you have to kind of think about this stuff if when you talk to people. And in this case, it was just one of those things where he just happened to be in the area, and he was this was the thing he was doing this day. Yeah. And so it was a number of times he was talking to media and everyone else. And then I sat down and was talking to him. But it was like, I'm not going to forget that, that conversation, and it stays with you. But then I did a radio story for CBC nationally on it. And I just, you take great care, and you want to get out the best part of an impactful part of his message, and keep that message as true as possible.
Yeah. I'd imagine something like that is a skill that is developed over time. I recall a guest that we had on this program. She was a United Nations WFP vulnerability analysis advisor, and she's been all around the world. She's based in Panama at the moment. But part of her job, of course, is going into communities, oftentimes that have been ravaged by some sort of disaster, natural or otherwise. And she's part of the team that's gathering a lot of information from people in terms of their needs. What hardships are they experiencing at the moment? And she said early on in her career, she would go, it's almost like a spectrum. She would go way far to, say, the left, and giving everything she had and investing herself so emotionally that it was just taking a toll on her and affecting her ability to do her job, well. But also at the same time, she understood that if she went too far on the other end of the spectrum and it was just cold and facts and tell me what you need, tell me what the problems are, that wasn't going to serve the needs either. So over the course of her career, she did find that sweet spot, essentially, of where she could, still empathize with people and show that emotion and build those connections, but then also still be, effective enough to do her job in the best possible way. And I'd imagine something like what you're doing and what you're speaking of, it's the exact same thing, essentially, is you're trying to find that spot. And of course, for each person, it's going to be different. But yeah, any thoughts on that?
I think it's exactly right. And it's something that in today's world, right, we for journalists, I think there's the struggle of just you're trying to figure out who you are as a journalist too. What kind of and if you're a political reporter, it's kind of different again. I mean, I think we all need to stay as human as possible anyways, no matter what we're reporting on. But if you're like the Tokyo Stock Exchange, I mean, that's a different type of reporting, right? But if you're doing interviews for a living, it's and then you're just trying to see, like, you're right, it also comes down to like self-care and yourself, right? And because these stories and these interviews, and like sometimes as a reporter, journalist, sometimes you're on the scene, or sometimes it's just because you're talking to people, but it's like I think over the phone, or sometimes what I do in the studio, there's always that weight that comes with it. And so every big story, right? Like, you're going to be involved with it. And those are all the big stories from the local level. So it could be something that can really affect you locally, or like now with Ukraine, right? Like my show today, we looked at the last couple of weeks of local coverage and connections from people in the Ukrainian community in Newfoundland and Labrador. We spoke to someone who has Russian roots here, who's talking about how they felt, and they felt horrified, by the way, about what's going on. And we talked about some of the fundraising efforts, but still, it's that main story that's always there. You're always talking about it, and it can take away. So you need to kind of make sure that you're taking care of you in order to be your best for doing your job for other people.
Yeah, I hear you wholeheartedly on that point. No, thank you for sharing. All right, well, kind of on the heels of this, conversation we just had, in terms of kind of this look at global stories, global experiences as well. Again, I've referenced that you spent some time within China, within Japan, and I'd be curious to know about how those experiences shaped you personally and even on the professional side.
Oh, the more travel you do, or the more especially when you live, like, so traveling is one thing. And then when you live somewhere else too, it just broadens your perspectives of the world, and it just makes you realize how much smaller the world is. So for example, in Newfoundland and Labrador, so here in the island of Newfoundland, there's this, because of, in the early 90s, like, the economy here used to be a big time fishing economy for cod. Yeah. Cod stocks collapsed, massive unemployment, and a lot of people from here had to move to what we call the mainland, the rest of Canada, for work. And so there's always been this longing for home in the culture here, and everyone's like, oh, how do you know, the old joke, right? How do you know a Newfoundlander in heaven? Oh, the only one who wants to go back home. And when I was in Japan, though, and up around the Fukushima area, and we were doing some stories up there, and you had people who really wanted to return to some didn't, obviously, but you had some people who really wanted to return to their communities, and this longing to go home. Yeah. And it's the same longing. It's just that if you don't travel, if you don't live somewhere else, sometimes you might think that you're unique in these feelings. But then when you go around, you start to see, well, no, now maybe it might be more intense, depending on, like, whether it's a family story, this or that, whatever it is. But those feelings are all there. So the longing that I saw in Japan reminded me of the longing that I'd heard about and been around here in Newfoundland so much growing up. And it felt, I mean, it was sad in a way because of the longing, but at the same time, it made me feel just that everything was so much closer.
Yeah, essentially it's sort of building these connections in a way, I guess, lots of different connections with people, culture, and bringing it all together, I suppose, in interesting ways and interesting takes, I guess, that you can kind of, like, I don't know, put out to the world, essentially,
Yeah, well, and it goes back to that empathy thing too, right? Because it goes back to, well, people here feel this way, and we feel this way, and they also feel this way. And guess what, folks? We all feel the same way about the same types of things. So maybe we can get along a little better because we realize we're not that different.
Community background to that as well, right? We keep circling back to that point. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. As far as, I guess, exploring all of this and some of the joyful elements, and uncovering some of these things like personal revelations, I suppose, for you, and then putting that out to the world, that must be quite rewarding at times as well, also. Yeah.
It is. It's one of those things, you start as a journalist, and I didn't even know I ever wanted to host radio, because when I first started, I was like, I think every question I started with was like, so, and then I would ask the question, and I listened to myself on tape like years ago, and I was just kind of like, that doesn't sound very good. You will never be a radio host. But then slowly but surely, you start reporting, doing enough stories, and you start to see what you like reporting on, and the stories that really speak to you, and then to just be part of that process. It is very rewarding, right? Because it's, especially when you sometimes, because I'm still new to the hosting bit, but like there are days when, you're like, wow, that show was really good today. And there are other days where you're like, that show could have been better. But there are the days where you're like, that was really good. And you just, yeah, and you're just thankful for everything. And you're just like, wow, I didn't think I'd get to be in this position working this job. And here I am, and it's still continuing.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. Most definitely. We've kind of spoken to this a little bit, and maybe you've already answered this, but as far as the job affecting you personally and shaping you, perhaps your views on the world, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's made me, I think there's another universe where if I wasn't doing this, like I wouldn't be as open-minded as I am. I don't think I would have those levels of empathy I'm talking about. I think naturally I'm an empathetic person, but the fact that I'm always trying to understand people and listen, especially, you look at in North America. I mean, the last couple of years, right? Like with the Black Lives Matter protests. Look at what's gone on with the Me Too movement. I mean, it's a time of when you look at white 40-year-old guys like me. It's a great time for us to listen a little bit more, I think. And
Agreed.
and it just so happens that I'm in a position where that's actually my job. And, I listen,
Yes.
and every so often I ask a question, and I think that it's made me a much better person because I think a lot. I think a lot about how other people are doing for any number. That can be because of gender, that can be because of race, that can be because of socioeconomic status, that can be because of where they live, is in geographically. But it's all helped me think more about other people and their situations.
Well said. Well said. And I can completely relate to all of those sentiments that you just shared. Again, myself living abroad for, going to be approaching 20 years now. And
Right?
yeah, it definitely opens up a different world to you. I remember growing up, I'm from Canada as well,
Yeah.
a border town, Fort Erie, Ontario, right across from Buffalo, New York. And I remember at that time, of course, the influence coming from the US was there, and it was always strong. It was just part of our community, essentially going across the border for, cross-border shopping trips, getting gasoline, things of that nature. I remember all of that stuff. And that was my world. I remember thinking that, Canadians and Americans were very similar in a lot of ways, which we are to a certain degree. But since living abroad and being away, and now, especially in the last little while too, seeing how things have played out, I've really noticed, of course, the differences in culture, the differences in views towards certain issues. And it's really become that much more refined. And I don't know if I would have necessarily, I don't know, come to sort of some of those realizations had I just grown up and stayed within that small town that entire time. But again, living abroad, not just say within America, you can start to, look at some of these other countries, European or otherwise, and start to understand, like you said, just dig in a little bit further, like who they are, what they stand for, and what makes them unique and what makes them special. So yeah, it does shape you. It does sort of shape your visions of the world and how you fit within it all. So yeah.
And
Okay.
also for yourself, I mean, when you talk about living 20 years in Japan, there's the meeting people and everything else. And just think of, and this is a bit of an aside, but just like all there's the culture of meeting people, and then there's like the food culture and everything. Can you imagine, like, think of all the great food even, and because there's
Right.
politics in food, there's history in food, there's passion in food, all of that you just would not have had at all, or just nowhere near like the levels, like just maybe like the slightest taste compared to all that you've gained through this, and like just what that does to like nourishing your body and soul.
Most definitely. Most definitely. And I can definitely attest to the point that, my tolerance level has gone perhaps from here to right off the screen, basically, because some of the things that I've been presented with here in Japan have been interesting, to say the least. But
Yeah.
yeah, it certainly broadened my own horizons as far as trying and tasting a number of different things, not just only within Japanese, food culture, but elsewhere. Yeah, it definitely opens you up to a lot of different possibilities and ways of doing things. And then even for yourself on this, we're going down a track here of food, but like trying things out yourself. Well, adding this in. Well, I tried this in the past. Why don't I take this ingredient and mix it in with something here? And you're creating almost this fusion of culture and food, but that's a whole different podcast, perhaps. Anyway, let's shift on over into a new segment here, Adam, a water cooler story. And it is kind of as it sounds. Basically, I just ask guests here to indulge listeners with a story relating to the profession. And I'll let you take it from here.
There's a few stories that kind of were coming to mind when we were talking about this, but there's one. It's about the interconnectedness of life. And I was in university, so I had a friend in university who he was from Afghanistan and came to Newfoundland and Labrador as a refugee, and we met in university, and we ran for some politics together, and like this was when we met. It was like just after 9/11, so there were like it was always this big part of a discussion. And over the years, like we stayed in touch. He became an international human rights lawyer. I moved into media. We like when I was in Tokyo, I saw him. He was in town, just had a meeting for something that he was doing with international human rights. And then last summer, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, we were back in touch. Just kind of, I was just saying, hey, like, how are you doing, type of a thing. And we ended up talking, and it's one of those times where like we ended up doing a show together. And I was clear that the old college buddy of mine or whatever, like off the beginning, but it was this really moving conversation just about his childhood home, his thoughts on what had happened. And I also found some old tape from just after 9/11, because CBC at the time had interviewed him. So we had that to play as well. And it just ended up being only in a world where like you've had this connection, you've had this shared knowledge together, you've stayed in touch, and then you have all this the knowledge of I guess this distant friendship over the years, that can you arrive at a moment for having this deep very respectful, obviously, but what I thought was a very interesting but touching at the same time and compelling conversation together, and for him to be up for doing it on the radio. It tied together years, it tied together different parts of the world, it tied so much together in terms of, and then for what it would have given, I think, the audience for listening, for context and their understanding of this is, for the local audience here, it's like, okay, that he was living here, but he's talking about the childhood home and everything that's kind of happened then, and what I think that could give for greater understanding of what was going on at the time as well. It's just one of those in my profession, one of those things that kind of thing it doesn't happen very often like that. So it really kind of stuck with me as something that, like, wow, that was it was just a conversation and it just happened to be on the air, but I won't be forgetting.
Yeah, it's interesting how some of those moments can really strike you and stay with you. And I guess, in terms of this story, bringing together all those different elements of, personal relationship, a friendship with somebody over so many years, and that rapport that you've built up with them. And then also, again, kind of talking to the point that we've already, gone over, charged issues, points that have a lot of controversy attached to them, but you're speaking to someone that you have this relationship with, and you're exposing a lot of different ideas and putting them out there. And again, coming back around to these ideas of empathy, creating opportunities for that to develop and to be, digested within others. I mean, there's a lot of positive outcomes that can be derived from something like that. And yeah, I can certainly see how that would be a rewarding experience on so many different levels. So,
and I think as well, it's one of those things where you never know how just everything can mean something big, right? Like years later or tomorrow or next week or whatever. And the little things that you do can really help you understand or move forward or move through other things in life,
Well said. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Adam. Yeah,
No problem.
Really appreciated hearing that. We are going to shift over into our last segment here. It's something called a crystal ball segment. And it is kind of, as the name implies, we're looking towards the future. Normally, we're looking at trends and predictions within a certain industry. So I'd like to return again to your industry and kind of lead off with this thought. I mean, social media, it's a very divisive topic, as we all know. And we also know that it's not going anywhere. Right? It's here to stay. So what's your take on it moving forward, as far as what it represents?
I think, it's obviously useful. For example, if you look at like Facebook and communities in Labrador. So Labrador, I'm on the island portion of the province. Well, I mean, I should know Christopher. And Labrador, it's further north. So you have a lot of isolated communities there. And in these communities, Facebook, I mean, it's the public notice board, right?
Yeah.
Like it plays a crucial role, actually. And you can see that side of it a lot. And even it doesn't have to be in isolated communities. I mean, I see it every day. Like people have different groups, and also like, or TikTok for the positive side of it, for young people using it. Yeah, it's easy to see. So there's that. Great. Mm-hmm. But then the future, when it comes to the bad side, I don't know. We got to figure some stuff out, because we can't having bad actors go on with disinformation. It hurts democracy, right? It hurts communities, it hurts people, it hurts democracy. And I mean, that's factual, right? Now, how that gets changed, I don't know.
Yeah.
They need to, so there's questions around, well, is it a government thing? Is it a self-policing thing? Is it there's lots of questions on how to do that. But I do think that, and I think now with Ukraine, and lately there's been more of a realization, especially with a lot of the disinformation that's being spread around. There's loads of talk in the last couple of weeks about stuff on TikTok and other places, in terms of, disinformation that people are just this is not true. So the conversation is there, and I think that we need to keep collectively having it in order to arrive at a better place where we can get the good of it without the downside.
Yeah. It's such a tough topic to digest and to really think about. Because I hear exactly what you're saying. I mean, in one respect, there are certainly a lot of benefits to having it. It does bring people together in a sense. People can unite, get behind certain ideas. If those ideas are virtuous, I mean, that's great. But if they're built off of what you just said, disinformation, it's going to lead to things that we're experiencing right now within Canada or elsewhere. This tribalism, this divide that, I'm sure you can also relate to this too. I mean, I truthfully have not seen this level of divide or experienced it. And I don't think any of us really have before. I mean, look no further than the events within Canada and the protests that were occurring there not too long ago. I mean, those things, of course, were built off the back of a lot of the social media sort of channels, and some takes some disinformation and so on and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, it's one of those charged sort of topics, issues. And I don't know. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, what are the solutions to this? And you have, net neutrality sort of arguments on the one hand, where people are like, don't touch it. There's, this is out there, we're allowed to shape and interact with this news in any way that we want. And the moment that you start coming in and, deciding what's right and what's wrong, well, then, we're being controlled.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
You have those arguments out there too. But also on the other hand, if you don't, then you've got some of these other sides to it. Again, this tribalism and this divide, which isn't serving the greater purpose or, helping in the sense of, bringing nations together and moving forward. I mean, it's such a difficult topic. I myself don't know where to go with it at times.
No, it is. You're right. It is such it's charged. It's tough to talk about. And, I think a lot of people nowadays feel that they're not being heard for one reason or another. And if we can find a way to just hearing people, and I don't mean by putting disinformation over the air or online. I mean, within, without the disinformation, misinformation, but to have conversations about hearing about why people are so upset, and because no one's going away, right? Like, we're all here, and we're going to be here tomorrow. So we have to figure out ways to continue to be here, because at the end of the day, that's how it is on this planet, right? And even though we don't agree, and even though we might be completely apart for very big reasons, and even if one of those is filled with disinformation, the other isn't, you're still going to be standing in front of or behind that person at the grocery store later this week.
Yeah. Or sitting across from the dinner table within families as well, right? I mean, you have that element to it all as well. Yeah. One other point really quickly here, on your own program, just recently, there was a segment where I think you had guests talking about like things like doom scrolling and going through some of the media and that was really interesting, by the way. But it's another element to it all also, in terms of the news that's going out there and how we digest it, and how that can lead to mental health issues as well that we need to consider also. And I thought that was a really interesting take, and I just wanted to kind of squeeze that in there while I had this
Sure.
chance. But Mm, yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, I try to have a mental health component to the show a lot because it's been a tough couple of years, and I think we're all just trying to do our best. And if they're like in this case, it was Karen Kehoe, a reporter. She's in New York, but also spends time. She's Canadian. Also reports from Toronto, known as the doom scrolling reminder lady. And Karen and I met in Tokyo when she was there one time, and so just to have her on to kind of talk about that with some context, and it's a friendly reminder just to like, hey, maybe we do need to drink a big glass of water and go to bed early instead of just engaging our brain with some of the doom and gloom out there continuously.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I liked about that segment, is a lot of the tips associated with it and the friendly reminders of it all, because it's something that, yeah, I'm sure a lot of us are, losing ourselves within at times. But yeah. All right. Well, I think we are rounding the bend here, Adam. We are heading into the end here, but I do want to take the time here to thank you for joining the program. I mean, it's been a riveting talk, and I've really enjoyed diving into it all with you. So thanks for coming on.
Christopher, thanks for having me. This has been a great chat.
Yeah, great. All right. For those interested in learning more about Adam and his work, you can tune into his show, CBC CrossTalk, and you can also find him on Twitter. And for reference, all of these links will be included in the show notes and also on the website. Also, if you like today's show, please be sure to share. To show further support, you can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And also, please don't forget to head on over to YouTube. We just launched a new channel there under Life as A, where you can get the full video recordings of these conversations. And finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as A, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. And until next time, stay curious about life and living.